Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Rocking in the Free World, Popular Music and the Politics of Freedom in Postwar America, by Nicholas Tochka, narrated by Dysart. A history of rock cannot help but violate the music's essence. As quick kicks, rock should be as disposable as a paper plate. That it isn't may reflect the kind of ersatz historical tug that masks America's empty sense of tradition. Then again, it may be that rock really does represent a lasting cultural statement, a popular expression that will survive its moment, either as artifact or artwork. Jim Miller, Rolling Stone Illustrated History of Rock and Roll, 1977. Make no mistake about it. Only America, the greatest social laboratory of the history of the planet, could have produced a cultural phenomena as singularly violent, plaintive, reckless, tender, risky, lurid, threatening, heart-wrenching, grotesque, corruptible, and vital as rock and roll. It took a land where every soul had a fairly decent shot at the awesome state of freedom with license to hatch an art form so triumphantly incendiary. Timothy White, Rock Stars, 1984. Preface. I'm sitting in the reading room at the National Library in Tirana, Albania, flipping through decades-old communist-era newspapers and journals. For the last few months, I had been reading chronologically, beginning in the 1950s. But as I reach the late 1980s, something strange happens. A few stories about American rock and roll, translated from English into Albanian, appear in the back pages of a few journals. The author bylines seem familiar, and suddenly I'm struck by a sense of déjà vu. These are the same kind of stories I had eagerly consumed in magazines like Rolling Stone or Guitar Player as an American teenager in the 1990s. But I am reading them out of context through the eyes of the pro-Western intellectuals self-appointed to oversee Albanians' transition from state socialism to market capitalism. Many of these people believed rock to be an important political symbol. For them, it represented a constellation of values related to freedom. And to these intellectuals, I would come to realize the stories that American journalists told about rock's political power provided a privileged lens for understanding their own communist past and democratic future. While that insight shaped my academic writing about how Albanians experienced post-socialism, my initial sense of disorientation remained, because I began pondering how American narratives about rock and roll had, in this case quite literally, been translated half a world away. I suddenly realized how little I understood about where these stories had come from in the first place. It seemed obvious to me that the stories Albanians were telling about rock and its politics of freedom explained more about the political situation in Albania than about a quality inherent in the music itself. So why hadn't I considered the opposite, that the stories Americans invented about rock and roll revealed equally significant insights about the United States? Like many fans, I had taken rock's self-mythologizing at face value. But where did these stories come from? And just how deeply had they shaped my own beliefs about freedom, democracy, and the very idea of America itself? If today I am a rock and roll skeptic, I once was a true believer. As a white teenager playing bass in garage bands during the 1990s, I acquired a basic musical grammar that emphasized simplicity, rawness, authenticity, honesty. My friends and I learned a particular story about the political significance of rock music, from its riotous origins in the 1950s to its countercultural roots in the 1960s, to its anti-establishment challenge in the 1970s, to its corporate subversion in the 1980s. Guitar magazines, trade paperbacks, classic concert films, and television documentaries guided our political maturation. We learned to appreciate the classics, groups such as the Beatles, The Doors, and Jimi Hendrix, and to recognize the genius of Bob Dylan, Lou Reed, and Frank Zappa. We came to value punk and hardcore groups such as the Ramones, Dead Kennedys, and Black Flag, and we discovered less commonly known, at least for suburban Massachusetts, critical darlings such as the Fugs, MC5, or Flipper. Above all, we learned to separate the real from the fake, artful self-expression from the soul-deadening commercial stuff. We even learned to play for real, expressing our own personal truths by imitating the sincerity we knew to listen for on record. Self-expression, individualism, the grit to speak truth to power. I'm sketching with broad strokes the kind of taken-for-granted, common-sense assumptions we held. For a long time, I held such truths to be self-evident, proof of the cultural and political significance of the music my friends and I esteemed. And we were not outliers. By the 2000s, the term rockism became a popular way to label this stance. A rockist, Kelefa Sanneh wrote in the New York Times, isn't just someone who loves rock and roll, who goes on and on about Bruce Springsteen, who champions ragged-voiced singer-songwriters no one has ever heard of. A rockist is someone who reduces rock and roll to a caricature, then uses that caricature as a weapon. Rockism means idolizing the authentic old legend, or underground hero, while mocking the latest pop star. Lionizing punk while barely tolerating disco. Loving the live show and hating the music video. Extolling the growling performer while hating the lip-syncer. Counter-perspectives emerge to nuance this critique, but on the whole, it rings true to me. For sure, I suffered from what Saul Austerlitz once called Rolling Stone disease. This syndrome has prompted two main responses. Criticism conducted under the label poptimism or popism aims to take seriously the kinds of commercial music formerly denied serious critical consideration. Poptimists institutionalize a more diverse array of musicians, mounting campaigns to induct hip-hop or pop artists into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, ensuring their annual year-end best album lists include artists from diverse demographic backgrounds, curating and archiving non-rock styles at their institutions, and broadening the purview of popular music history surveys at their universities. And to this compensatory work has been joined a new strain of revisionist historiography. The revisionist historians often eschew major styles, artists, and trends. They instead seek out the untapped margins of popular music's forgotten or silenced histories, choosing topics, styles, or locations that allow them to foreground the contributions of a more diverse cast of characters. And so, by and large, much writing about the heyday of rock and roll, let's say the period between the 1950s and the 1980s, now begins from a position of mistrust. On closer examination, that ineffable essence that rock's chroniclers had for so long taken for granted, its rebelliousness, its potentials for resistance, its sheer political power, seems to float in the air, unsupported by any edifice. Authors inevitably must tell the secret or untold or shadow histories of rock, uncovering its hidden figures, performances, and stories. This book takes the opposite tact. It revisits major figures, albums, and performances, composing rock and roll's mainstream, not-so-hidden narratives. In the following chapters, I examine how dominant stories about the political significance of rock music could emerge. That is, I sketch the conditions of possibility in which rock acquired political meanings between the 1950s and the 1980s. Recent reappraisals of that era have helped explain the erasure from rockist narratives of people who were not white, male, or heterosexual. But we still need to parse the basis on which so many critics and fans argued for rock's significance in the first place, its purported political power in general, as well as its imagined relationship to a collection of American cultural values in particular. As my own political commitments evolve, I'm finding myself questioning certain long-standing claims about the power of music to affect change. My coursework in graduate school taught me to identify how popular music gives voices to the voiceless, how it enables the politically disenfranchised to imagine new political futures for themselves, how it challenges illiberalism, and resists or even subverts authoritarian political structures. As I'm writing these words today, liberals in the United States are making similar claims with renewed urgency. That's one reason why I think we need to understand where these ideas came from in the first place, because knowing the genesis of these stories and how they spread so widely might allow us to see more clearly the potentials, but also the limits, of music as a political force in the United States today. Prologue. Popular music as political theory. It is late January of 1988, and rock royalty packs the grand ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria in Manhattan for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame's induction ceremony. Rock and roll screamer Little Richard laughs with Rolling Stone founder Jan Wenner and famed label boss Ahmet Ertegun as these and other major figures carve out places for themselves in the history of this distinctly American art form. Bruce Springsteen is on hand to introduce Bob Dylan, honored this year with the Beatles, the Beach Boys, the Drifters, and the Supremes as a foundational voice in the tradition. Stepping on stage, he delivers what the amused critic at the Washington Post calls a Bruce Springsteen Memorial Induction Anecdote. The first time I heard Bob Dylan, Springsteen begins, I was in the car with my mother and we were listening to maybe WMCA. And on came that snare shot that sounded like somebody kicked open the door to your mind, from Like a Rolling Stone. I ran out and I bought the single and ran home and put on the 45. But they must have made a mistake at the factory because a Lenny Welch song came out. The label was wrong. So I ran back, got the Dylan record, and I came back and I played it. The audience claps and laughs. The single might have been Welch's Since I Fell For You, a hit by this schmaltzy, middle-of-the-road crooner that reached number 4 on the Billboard charts in 1963. Or Taste of Honey, released the previous year. The cameras do not pan to Paul, George, and Ringo, who included a saccharine cover of that song on Please Please Me. The audience is laughing in recognition. They understand that a teenage Springsteen needed something real, that voice that thrilled and scared him, those lyrics that raised the hairs on the back of his neck. He needed that snare shot, not syrupy, commercial Lenny Welch. Back to the podium. Dylan was a revolutionary, Springsteen concludes. The way that Elvis freed your body, Bob freed your mind. He showed us that just because the music was innately physical did not mean that it was anti-intellect. He had the vision and the talent to expand a pop song until it could contain the whole world. 6 months later, Springsteen brought the E Street Band to East Berlin on their Tunnel of Love Express tour. I'm not here for any government, Springsteen tells the Berlin audience in halting German, reading from a scrap of paper words rendered phonetically by his taxi driver just an hour before. I've come to play rock and roll for you in the hope that one day all the barriers will be torn down. The E Street Band launches into the opening chords of Chimes of Freedom from 1964, Dylan's psalm to the marginalized and the downtrodden, here ringing out against a Berlin wall soon to crumble, then fall. 6 weeks after East Berlin, Springsteen headed back out on the road to headline Amnesty International's Human Rights Now tour, organized by legendary rock promoter Bill Graham. This latest iteration in a string of charity mega events sought to raise money and awareness about political prisoners. Feel as if the collective spirit of rock has suddenly been hot-wired for social activism? Time magazine asked. Ticket purchases included a pocket edition of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, T-shirts emblazoned with the tour logo. A dynamic human figure crashing through a wall could be bought separately. And the all-star lineup's encore? a massive sing-along to Dylan's 1967 song, I Shall Be Released. Though each musician appears at different points, this book is not about Springsteen or Dylan. Rather, it seeks to explain how political labels related to an abstract, U.S.-invented notion of freedom became affixed to rock music and certain kinds of rock musicians between the 1950s and the 1980s. Springsteen provides a useful example of this phenomena as it reached its mature form. Consider how both liberal Walter Mondale and conservative Ronald Reagan sought his endorsement during their 1984 presidential campaigns, though Springsteen disavowed each. "I'm not registered as one party or another," he told Rolling Stone's Kurt Loder. "I don't generally think along those lines." Or consider how rock's meaning had become so elastic that America's longest-standing liberal outlet, The Nation, could laud Springsteen for having brought an unmistakable progressive political message to his concerts. And this in describing a tour supporting the album, the conservative National Review praised songs whose heroes are invested with a cowboy libertarianism. We are beginning at the end, at the culmination of a grand narrative about the political significance of rock music in the United States. The story explained the music's revolutionary potential. Rock hit you in the gut. It taught you to liberate yourself, body and mind. It freed you from the social mores and structures that tried to make you unfree. The rock gospel, the revelation of that first snare hit, divided your life into two distinct periods, before rock and after. Its ambassadors promoted rock's message globally. Publishers and critics helped theorize its contours in the mainstream press. A body of albums, songs, and performances authored by figures such as Springsteen and Dylan comprise its canon. This kind of music, it seemed, could only have originated in the United States. After all, the conditions that produced rock had also forged the national temperament of the American people, maybe even the democratic nature of the First World itself. Nowhere would the American character of rock music emerge quite so distinctly than when exported outside this free world. Electric guitars feeding back up and over the Berlin Wall, power chords ringing out to shred the Iron Curtain. Rock musicians helped teach the captive peoples of the Second World the meaning of freedom. Coming together in song, these same musicians expressed in one voice the imperative to emancipate the developing peoples of the Third World from their bonds of poverty and backwardness. For ultimately, rock's message had revealed itself to be universal, capable of addressing the human condition itself. Or at least that's the story. But we can unbundle the threads making up this larger narrative, tracing each constituent strand's history to its first emergence, stripping away its assumptions about the nature of the post-war world, its inhabitants, and the power of popular music. Because rock and roll had to become enmeshed with an entire constellation of political values that, at least initially in the 1950s, seemed entirely at odds with this new style, radical conservatives wove conspiracy theories about rock and roll's communist origins, while racists damned the jungle rhythms of this mau-mau music as not just black but backwards. Liberals worried about the dehumanizing effects of this textbook example of mass culture, as social scientists predicted dire political consequences for young consumers, cataloging the music's deleterious effects alongside the maleficent specters of Second World brainwashing and Third World trancing practices. From a plot to promote unthinking conformism to a vehicle for authentic self-expression, from a technique for social control to a means of radical political liberation, from a declaration of barbarism to an expression of universal transcendence, Americans would learn the truth about rock and roll and its politics of freedom. There exists in the United States a long tradition of narrating the relationship between rock music and liberation. This is a kind of freedom we are learning about, American rock critic Greil Marcus wrote in Who Put the Bump, from his important early collection of essays, Rock and Roll Will Stand, from 1969. Affecting our own perspectives, artistic, social, and personal, it makes the tangible and the factual that much more reprehensible, that much more deadening. The intellectual leap, the habit of free association, the facility of making a single rock and roll metaphor the defining idea for a situation or a time of one's life. That is the kind of thinking that makes sense. By 1975, Marcus had expanded that conceptualization of the single rock and roll metaphor in his classic book, Mystery Train, arguing that rock and roll explains America, and America, rock and roll. What I bring to this book, at any rate, is no attempt at synthesis, he states in the prologue, but a recognition of unities in the American imagination that already exist. They are natural unities, I think, but elusive. I learned in the past 2 years that simply because of those unities, the resonance of the best American images with rock and roll is profoundly deep and impossibly broad. Through recordings, rock musicians delivered a new vision of America with their music, and more people than anyone can count are still trying to figure out how to live in it. The best artists dramatize a sense of what it is to be American. Marcus continues, what it means, what it's worth, and what the stakes of life in America might be. Close examination of this music and their stories reveals struggles and aspirations, indeed the limitations and potentials of America itself. And it's at this point that claims about identity become assertions about a politics of freedom. It may be that the most interesting American struggle is the struggle to set oneself free from the limits one is born to, and then to learn something of the value of those limits. For sure, Marcus is not naive. I wonder if he's just too good a writer, too persuasive, incapable of resisting a soaring rhetorical flourish or small exaggeration in the service of his inimitable style. And certainly not all critics have agreed with the loftier pronouncements. Rock is not political theory, Langdon Winner wrote, also in Rock Will Stand, and never will be. So I am less interested in testing the claims that writers like Marcus make about rock music than in understanding how these claims first came to seem common sense. That is not to say that the political labels people attach to rock music have been in any way coherent. To again use American presidential campaigns as a kind of crude barometer, every candidate since 1968, when a young Jerry Garcia appeared fleetingly in a Nixon ad pitched to the American youth, has invoked the messaging power of rock in one way or another. The aim here is more modest, to catalog some of the labels people have assigned to rock music from the 1950s and the 1980s, and to place these people within the post-war context that made their labeling seem not only obvious, but also essential. Before we get to those moments, a brief note on methods. As I've suggested, the politics of popular music to many of us makes sense at a gut level. We just know that it stands for rebellion, that it provides a means for not only challenging but also transforming the status quo. We know that illiberal states make policies to curtail its power, that they silence the voices of rock musicians, and we assume that this is a logical response. Rock did help topple the Berlin Wall, right? Its core values, self-expression, individuality, truthfulness, also undergird liberal democracy, do they not? You can actually hear these political values. They are woven through lyrics and productions, embedded deep within the very grain of musicians' voices and instruments. To combat my own biases, I've set for myself a few guiding questions. How did these values and truths become so self-evident? Over the course of the 20th century, why did certain values and labels stick while others did not? And what were the broader conditions of possibility in which the politics of rock could emerge in post-war America? The myth is the starting point, not the destination. And instead of merely deconstructing the narrative, we must parse the conditions that made this story possible. Following the model of Jack Hamilton, who explained how Americans learned that rock was white, I want to tell the story of those stories, about how rock set us free. And so my object is also to listen to the music against and alongside the stories we've told ourselves about it. Time has worn down their rough edges, smoothing these stories into forms we recognize today. To restore their original features, the following chapters examine 7 key moments when rock and roll acquired its political meanings. These moments do not represent a comprehensive list. Certain events, people, and ideas have necessarily been left out. Guiding my selection has been overall significance. Was a problem widely discussed in its time? Did it directly influence how future commentators talked about rock music? And could it be argued that the problem helped shape how Americans see themselves today? Debate has often arisen when someone claimed there existed a relationship between popular music and one or another political economic system or ideology, whether democracy or capitalism, socialism or communism, fascism or anarchism. But such political labels, as well as their broader associated constellation of values, did not simply affix themselves willy-nilly to any musical style, artist, or performance. This depended on individuals who, for diverse reasons, knotted together or articulated political ideas with rock at certain moments. Nor did this process always occur smoothly or predictably, and we will encounter contradictions and counter-debates. Because there's no reason why rock had to have acquired any of these specific extra-musical connotations. But the music did, and this resulted in new political truths about the power of music in general and rock and roll in particular. And so here we are. This is a book about rock and roll, some of it, and America. Or better, this is a book about rock and roll and one particular story of America. It considers those musicians understood to have been endowed with an ability to express politically significant visions of American democracy, and those sounds understood to exemplify some ineffable spirit of freedom. It is about a particular, idealized vision of the United States, especially as this vision came to be fixed within an entire constellation of values concerning autonomy, individualism, self-expression, and democracy. And primarily as these values became to be conceived as peculiarly American. It is not a history of the genre, but rather an elusive, at times even opportunistic, examination of the conditions that allowed these values to be attributed to rock and roll. It offers scant analysis of the music itself, instead locating albums, songs, and performances within some unexpected social and political contexts. The stories recounted here hardly reveal the entire picture. Yet, understanding where these stories came from and why they once made sense to so many people may tell us something useful about the nature of 20th century political power in the United States. So, this is what this book is about. Americans imagine, or once did imagine, that rock musicians manifest powerful political truths through their live and recorded performances. What post-war conditions, cultural and demographic, technological and ideological, enabled musicians and listeners to imaginatively link rock music to certain kinds of liberal, democratic values between the 1950s and the 1980s. And what have been the consequences, both at home and abroad, of telling these stories? Put simply, how did Americans learn that rock can make you free? 1. How rock and roll invented the teenager. On a cool spring evening in 1958, disc jockey Alan Freed rocked Boston. Alan Freed Presents the Big Beat featured Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, and Frankie Lyman. The review registered record ticket sales, thanks in no small part to Freed's hype for what his promotional materials called this basic American heritage. The Boston Arena show, however, proved the beginning of the end for the showman's career. Conflicting reports emerged as to what actually happened that Saturday night. The review seemingly proceeded as planned until the venue's manager turned on the...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?